Hi, I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo magazine, and I'm really pleased that you've chosen to watch this recording of a TAFAF talk, which took place on the 2nd of November 2020. The theme of this talk is the display of historical art in modern or modernist buildings, and it's timed to coincide with the temporary relocation of the Frick collection to the Breuer building on Madison Avenue, while its home on Central Park undergoes extension and renovation. I'm afraid on what you're about to listen to and watch, I appear only as an audio participant due to technical problems that occurred in the recording on the 2nd of November. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoy this TAFAF talk.
Good evening and welcome to this second TAFAF talk hosted by Apollo magazine. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo, and I'm afraid that for the duration of this talk, I'm likely to stay a disembodied voice asking questions because in the run-up to the event, I'm afraid we've experienced some technical problems, but we are going to work on, and I hope that you'll be able to hear me throughout. And nonetheless, our speakers are on video this evening. This talk is inspired by the temporary movement relocation of the Frick collection early next year from its building on Central Park to the old Whitney Museum of Art building, the so-called Breuer building designed by Marcel Breuer in the 1960s. It was recently the home of the Met Breuer, and now for 2 years the Frick will be moving its collections in and reframing its collection in the Breuer building. It's a museum, the Frick, that is much loved in situ in its home. It's one of those museums that is loved so much that, and its collections seem so much a part of its rooms, that the rooms are named, the Fragonard room, the Boucher room, the music room. But the purpose of this evening is not to talk about the whys and wherefores of the Frick expansion or the Frick relocation, but to think about this relocation as an opportunity, as an exciting temporary project that has a lineage, that has that sits in a tradition of displaying historical art in modern or modernist or mid-century buildings. There are many examples of great architects who have worked on museum buildings, and I'm just going to show one or two to give a sense of where we are, where we're setting ourselves today. Here is Carlo Scarpa's work in Verona at the Museo di Castelvecchio, again in the post-war period. And perhaps we'll come back to this. There, on the left, you can see the great sculpture of Can Grande elevated above the castle courtyard. Here are a couple of examples from the States. Great works by Louis Kahn, whose museum buildings include the Kimbell Art Museum at Fort Worth on the left-hand side from 1972, and the Yale Center for British Art, his last building. That's the Long Gallery there on the right-hand side. And finally, I'll just show you the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo. This is the redisplay of the collection as initially imagined by Lina Bobadi, also in the 60s, a building that opened, designed by her in 1968. I've asked our speakers this evening to pick out one image each, or two images each, just to give us some perspectives on what we're going to be talking about this evening. Let me introduce the three speakers and then I'll invite them to speak. Amy Young is curator at the Frick Collection in New York. She's a specialist on Italian Renaissance art and British art of the 18th and 19th centuries, and has curated many exhibitions at the Frick, including on Moroni's portraits, on European portrait medals, and on Parmigianino. And she's been working very closely with the rest of the team at the Frick on the relocation of the Frick collection to the Breuer building. She recently authored a book, co-authored a book with William Kentridge on Constable's White Horse. Penelope Curtis was until recently director of the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, for which she recently conceived an exhibition called Art on Display for the 50th anniversary of the museum. It drew in research on some of the great architects who tried to rethink museum displays in the post-war period. The Smiths, Aldo van Eyck, Scarpa, Bobardi, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from her about the ideas behind that exhibition this evening. It's now open in Rotterdam. And Charles Samores Smith has been a museum director of the National Portrait Gallery, of the National Gallery, and more recently as the secretary and CEO of the Royal Academy of Arts in London. But in his latter career, he is now working as a writer. And I've invited Charles to join the panel this evening because his new book is out next year, and it's called The Art Museum in Modern Times. And it focuses on a number of the projects, also later projects, that we're going to be discussing this evening, from Marcel Breuer's design for the Whitney to the Neue Gallery in New York to the West Bund Museum in Shanghai. And he also can speak to us this evening as someone who has been a museum builder himself, with new wings, with new buildings at the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery. I hope you can all hear me. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I will be looking through the Q&A box if people have questions that they would like to ask our speakers. So I'm going to ask you, Amy, if you can hear me, to speak first about the images you've chosen this evening.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. And hello to everybody joining us today. On the screen on the left, of course, is the Fifth Avenue facade of the Frick Collection in New York. And on the right is the Breuer building at 945 Madison Avenue. And just to give you a little bit of background, I guess, on this whole situation, when the Frick advanced plans for the renovation of the Historic House Museum, which is a 1914 building with modifications in 1930s and in the 1970s, we had a choice. Over the course of the renovation period, which is going to be about 3 years, we could go dark, all the art offsite in storage, all the staff in offsite, no museum visitors, no museum to operate. If someone had told us what 2020 was going to bring, that option probably would have been seemed like a very, very attractive one than it did at the time, which was a few years ago. The other option, which is the one we took, obviously, was to find a temporary location, a place for us to make available to our public and our members the art of the Frick collection. So among a number of possibilities, the Breuer building came to be pretty much an ideal solution, and not only because of its proximity, so it's only 5 blocks from the Frick, but also because it's a solution that allows us to have all of the staff, all of our storage, the functions of the Frick Art Reference Library, and 3 floors of gallery space all on the same site. So what had been a practical solution turned out to be this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to show the Frick's collection in a totally new way in this modernist space. To give you a little bit of insight into the way that we approached the installation from a curatorial point of view, and the project is called Frick Madison, we had, let's say, 2 leading guiding principles. One was to respect our collection. And by that, I mean, how could we preserve, retain the experiences of directness and intimacy of viewing and being with art at the Frick, and translate that into a modernist space. And the other principle, I would say, was a respect for the building itself. So Breuer's building, how could we harmonize with, celebrate even, the spaces, the windows, the materials, concrete, wood, bronze, bluestone, using through the installation of an old master collection of paintings, sculpture, and decorative arts objects. So we're excited to unveil this installation when we open early next year, early 2021. And in the meantime, we're just so grateful to be able to think about this project, Frick Madison, in a broader historical context, and especially with such esteemed co-panelists as Penelope and Charles, and of course you, Tom, as the voice of God.
It's an enviable and unenviable position to be in, I have to say, watching you on your screens. Amy, thanks very much. I'm really looking forward to delving into some of the ideas you've been perusing and thinking about in terms of the lineage of placing the Frick collection into the Breuer building. You mentioned materials as well, and materiality and modernist building juxtaposed with historic art is something I certainly want us to cover this evening or this afternoon for you over in New York. Penelope, let me ask you to talk about the images that you've chosen, which I'm now going to show.
Okay, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost an exact parallel, really, with the Frick. Very interesting for me. Calouste Gulbenkian, the man, died in 1955, and his museum opened in 1969. And we're fairly confident in saying that he would not have liked the museum that was opened in his name. His collection was displayed in a 18th century hotel in Paris, which had been redesigned lightly by an Art Deco designer. But his whole feeling was for a Beaux-Arts kind of classical type building. He would have much preferred the old Frick than the Breuer building for his collection. But because he died, there was an opportunity to make something that was completely different. And I think the exhibition we had on show, and is now in Rotterdam, was really looking at that window between about 1953 and the Kahn Yale University building and 69 or 70 and the buildings by late Kahn or Mies. It's a very, very interesting window of time, I think, and something happened which it was really unique. That was the reason we chose that particular kind of time span, I think, in looking at this moment. Because after 69, you begin to move into buildings like the Pompidou, which are much more focused on a kind of temporary exhibition notion rather than something that is permanent, a fixed installation with a kind of gravitas. I think what our exhibition was trying to do was to firstly uncover more of the work of Albini, who had been employed by the Gulbenkian to do the interior. And I think what's important here is to remember that it's about modernist architecture and the building, as well as the actual design inside. So it's not a revamping of an old building like Albini and Scarpa in Italy. This is a new building with also a new interior. And you see the new interior on the right. And that's an interior that's been so successful that it's really still in place. And that's another interesting thing about the Gulbenkian. It's almost a kind of time capsule. What the exhibition tried to understand better was, why was this building so successful? Why do visitors love to walk around it? And it's something, I think, to do with a respect for the art, giving pieces plenty of space, but also a kind of gentle monumentality. So there's a sense of fixity. The materials are good materials. It's good concrete, bronze, carpet, etc. But also a kind of new democratic approach to the idea that the visitor can move in the way they choose. They're not overawed. So it's very much anti-fascist, I would say. It's very much a product of the post-war period. And it's neither very high nor very low. So it's kind of in between. And I think it draws on many of the domestic projects that Mies had done in the 30s for private clients. So it's between a modernist villa and a modernist building on a more public scale. It has this kind of in-between size. So I think our exhibition was about understanding what we had already better, the Albini effect, I called it, in the museum, but also looking at how Albini, in a sense, because the project had lasted so long, by the time it opened, the museum was already a bit old-fashioned. And people like the Smithsons and Lino Bobardi were doing things that were much more radical. But those things were overturned in many ways, whereas the Gulbenkian Museum is still there. It's lasted very well. Okay? I've stopped now.
Thank you very much. I love this idea of, thank you very much, Penelope. I love this idea of a gentle monumentality, and that's something we might come back to. And specifically thinking about how architects conceive in the post-war period of how people move through and around artworks, the extent to which perhaps as well in some of these projects that you've mentioned, artworks become, perhaps especially paintings, become more sculptural than they had been in other contexts.
Yeah.
They're moved away from the wall. Charles, let me pull up your slide.
Yeah, maybe I'll begin by saying that actually the last thing I did before lockdown in March was to go and see art on display in Lisbon. And I found it very rewarding, partly because I think it reminds one that what the Gulbenkian did in the late 60s was actually the orthodoxy everywhere at that time. One's sort of forgotten that in Britain, as in Portugal, in the late 60s, the Christchurch Picture Gallery opened. The Christchurch Picture Gallery was designed in a kind of colour scarpa type way. And when Michael Levy became director of the National Gallery, he was absolutely determined to do everything possible to disguise and get rid of everything about the National Gallery, which we now think of as the standard way of showing pictures, so that he got rid of all the architectural details and got rid of the wallpaper and tried to make it look like a scarpa interior rather than like a grand 19th century country house. And in a sort of way, it was the attack on what the National Gallery looked like in the mid-80s that I think led to change based on a Fitzwilliam style, more country house way of displaying paintings that has made us now think that it's normal and expected that historical paintings should be shown in a historical country house way, but that hasn't been the orthodoxy in the past. So my image is the basement of Burlington House. And I was very interested that when we had Adrian Gaudet, the exhibition designer, to work with us on the redisplays of the collection, we hired him actually to do a relatively conventional display of the permanent collection upstairs in Burlington Gardens. And he said that what we ought to do is make use of the non-gallery spaces. And so we used this, what had been thought of as just a corridor between the two buildings. And interestingly, I think, I mean, I don't know because I'm no longer there, so I don't know what the visitor responses and reactions have been. But my sense was, when I was still there, that people in some ways preferred this style of slightly accidental, haphazard, episodic display to the systematic and more conventional display upstairs. And in writing this book, which is coming out in March, what I realized is that actually what we were doing at the Royal Academy is quite standard and in a sort of way replicates the difference between the old Tate Modern and the new Tate Modern, where the old Tate Modern had a sense of systematic order in the way the galleries were laid out, whereas the Blavatnik wing is based on the architect's idea of I forget what they call it, cabinet spaces. And so that switch from a conventional ordered systematic display to something which is more exploratory is most evident, of course, of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the controversy around that, the switch from an encyclopedic museum to somewhere where you discover things. And so I used the emblem of the basement of the Royal Academy to exemplify that switch.
I think that's another fascinating moment in many of the projects that we've already brought onto the screen, is that in many ways, not only are some of these architectural ideas about the about space and how people move through it, but about disrupting certain types of chronology or certain types of hierarchy between types of artwork. It's something that certainly we see in Lina Bo Bardi's great transparent forest of images with labels all on the back of them rather than on the front of them. It's something that perhaps also we see in some of the Louis Kahn projects. Let me ask you, Amy, to talk a little bit about thinking, when you started thinking about how Frick Madison is going to look, what have been some of the most influential precursors for you in thinking about historical art in modernist buildings?
Well, it's an interesting question because when I were even putting together what such a lineage could be, if you stack these images up next to each other, what became immediately apparent was how varied actually these spaces and places are, and how case by case each one could seem to somebody looking at it in a practical way. Let's take the element, for example, of walls. How do we treat walls at Frick Madison in the Breuer building? Well, if we look at Louis Kahn at the Kimbell, there's travertine walls, and you're going to put up a beautiful canaletto on travertine. And then every so often you can, if you'd like, introduce within the proportions of his building these additional walls to map out the space in a different way. Then Lina Bobardi, if you want to look at that, well, maybe no walls, or perhaps you can call them very small, transparent walls. Whereas at the Breuer building, there are no interior walls. So the idea was that he let's say, created the ability for those who are installing art to divide the space up as he or she so pleased, depending upon what was to be installed, what was to be viewed. And so that kind of variation sort of was an important thing for us to recognize, but also for us to think about in this lineage, what does bring these buildings and cases together? And that's probably a chapter in Charles's book, what brings these cases together. But in all of it, I guess the short answer is we took a little bit of what each case offered for the art that was to be installed, recognizing that what we're installing at Frick Madison is not just a Holbein and a Titian, but we have, up to Manet, we have Japanese and Chinese porcelains, we have Mughal carpets. So that there is also a diversity within what you're showing, within the umbrella of an old master collection for sure, but what you're showing has so much to do with how you're going to install.
Yeah.
A lot of these projects, these architects, Scarpa perhaps being the great example, were obsessed with detail, were obsessed with materiality, were obsessed with the craft of creating ways of displaying, of finish, of thinking about easels or new techniques for displaying things against or away from the wall. But I do wonder, though, whether there is, Penelope, perhaps a misconception that a lot of modernist museum buildings are seen as somehow either minimalist or brutalist, and therefore as sort of just blank spaces for doing what people like in them. Do you think that misconception perhaps exists somewhere out there in the museum world?
Well, I think that the buildings we're talking about were very unusual because they had high budgets, and in fact they were obsessed with using beautiful materials. But as Amy was saying, I think that especially when we're talking about objets d'art and furniture and ceramics and glass and so on, we're looking at a design that is going to be quite fixed. So they looked for something that was semi-permanent, if not permanent. And the other thing I wanted to add was that I think we underplay the fact that these architects were also almost acting like curators in choosing the works that they thought would be most communicative, and being very ready to put the majority of works into the reserves in order to free up space for a fewer number of pieces. And if you think about what's happening now at the Boymans in Rotterdam, it's almost exactly the opposite, that they have this beautiful old building from the 1930s, in which they showed the creme de la creme. But now they have next door a building which is going to show everything. So there's this also a shift between editing down, and I think that's what Scarpa and Albini did so well with the framework of the modernist architecture around them. A few pieces beautifully fixed to the wall for all time almost, in comparison to the idea now in which we see everything. And the viewer decides what is important. So there's this kind of new sense of lack of editing.
Charles, is that something that strikes a chord with you? This idea that these towering architects from the 50s, 60s, 70s somehow, perhaps, in being able to promote an idea of good design and good museum design and good exhibition design, became surrogate curators?
Well, from what I only know about Albini from the excellent Castle Gulbenkian on display, and he, like Scarpa, it was an installation. I mean, he was trained as an architect in Milan in the 30s, but then in the work he did in Genoa and the work Scarpa did in Verona, I mean, Castelvecchio, the surroundings, as you can see on the screen, were as given. The walls were there. So what he was hired to do was to do the installation. What seems to have happened subsequently, and I think that's true of Norman Foster with the Sainsbury Centre, which is in a way influenced by this idea of taking art off the walls. And if one's thinking of the Frick, combining both pictures and sculpture and decorative arts. But thereafter, what you get is a division between the architect who does the exterior, sort of at the Getty. Richard Myers hired after a huge, great international process and does all the exteriors and the museum buildings and the entryway. But when it comes to the hanging of the picture, the Getty goes out and has an interior designer. And so that I think is one of the reasons that we've got used to a sort of, inverted commas, historical style of displaying pictures, because often, even when they're modern buildings, as in the Getty, they've tended to go out and hire somebody who's used to doing grand interiors for rich people in Manhattan. So that it's a sort of interior design view of how museums and galleries should look.
Since you mentioned the walls at Castelvecchio, I'm just going to point out that detail to the audience. I think that there were numerous interventions. There were staircases removed, Napoleonic staircase, and there were others added. But that really intriguing detail that the floor is never quite connected to the walls. So there's always a gap, or almost like a little moat in the gallery, as if there's a staging of art that somehow is not quite connected to the building in which it inhabits. Amy, in terms of thinking about the interiors and the details that the Breuer building has, and of course many of them restored before the Met moved into the building, the extraordinary windows, the light fittings, the raw materials, and others. How far have those been things that you have had to think specifically about in terms of how they inform the art that you're going to be displaying as you display it?
So to clarify, it was under the Met's leadership and stewardship that the entire Breuer building was, let's say, restored very carefully, cleaning out little bits between the bush hammered concrete and the stairwell, etc. A whole, thinking about installing a collection that is so wedded to place, like the Frick is, the nearest that we could come to sort of respecting our collection's historic relationship to its site was to take pointers, let's say, from the materials around which these new objects, Holbeins and Bellinis would be seen. So absolutely, there are very few windows. You can see the very big one in the front of the Breuer building overlooking Madison Avenue. And there's probably only one other gallery accessible window in our gallery space. Those become points of departure for us. So those are elements that are not to be fought with, are not to be brought into anything but some sort of harmonious conversation. And that our press people don't want me to say too much specifically about the details of our installation, but it is sort of that underlying principle is take from the building. What can we do from the building up to make a harmonious sense with our somewhat eclectic collection already.
I don't really want to. I think that the proof of your display ought to be in its unveiling, and I'm sure many people who are watching are looking forward to that innovation and that experiment. And I think it's a welcome time for experimentation. Is my personal opinion. I wanted to go back, though, to think about what Penelope had talked about in terms of this sense of movement through some of these buildings and a democratization. And Penelope, I wondered as well, in some of the architects that you, whose spaces you reconstructed and displays that you reconstructed, an idea of play, perhaps, which seems to be something that is sometimes forgotten about post-war architecture, but it seems to be something that is there in some of these conceptions of display. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a bigger question, and it probably moves away from the immediate Frick topic.
That's fine. That's good.
I think what we realized was there was a big contrast between the architects who were working with permanent collections and the architects who were doing temporary exhibitions. So while Albini and Scarpa were in our exhibition focusing on permanent collections, and I think they had no sense of time-limited installation, which is very different from nowadays, probably. Whereas when we moved on to the Smithsons and Lina Bobardi, well, less Lina Bobardi because she was also working with a permanent collection, but I think you're particularly referring to the Smithsons and Aldo van Eyck. And Aldo van Eyck is famous not only as someone who designed temporary exhibitions, but also was someone who literally designed playgrounds, many playgrounds for children in Holland. So he was very interested in how little children naturally interacted with objects and art. And the Smithsons, they had this fantastic opportunity to transform the whole of the Tate Gallery, as was, into an exhibition space. And they did that in many ways by using a kind of pavilion approach to the museum. So maybe the underlying message of our exhibition was that there was such a huge contrast between what the architects would do if they were working on a temporary show and if they were working on a permanent installation. And it was trying to understand how they were thinking about their audiences. They were all thinking in different ways about how to bring art to the audience. It was obviously a topic at that point. And Albini was doing it in one way, which was much more to do with quiet, comfortable contemplation, making the person feel at ease in their surroundings. But they were all interested in linking the outside and the inside and trying to make the art museum more a part of the real world. Tom?
I am here, and Charles, just thinking, I want to just move on from this idea of how people move through museums, although I am very interested in how things have come away from the wall often in the modern period. But I think that one thing that it would be quite helpful for us to discuss is light as well in some of these buildings. You've talked a little bit, Charles, about the country house style of display. And of course, the country house style display often, well, to some degree and to generalize, relies almost on a crepuscular sense that we're always in a perpetual evening somewhere in the countryside, perhaps in sort of like we somehow stepped into Bleak House or something like that. But of course, for a lot of these architects, thinking with light, with a limited range of materials, albeit quite expensive ones, was a very important conception. I know you're a big fan of Louis Kahn, who spoke about the Kimbell and said that light is the theme of this building. And I wonder whether you feel that in the post-war period, there was a flooding of natural light became an important way of seeing art for a lot of these architects.
Yes, I found something very interesting recently. I went around the British Museum. I mean, of course, I've been around lots of times, but I've never been with it so empty. And I went into the John Russell Pope room housing the Elgin marbles. And I'd always thought, I'm afraid, that the display of the Elgin marbles was dull. But it's your use of the term crepuscular that actually I realized it is very low key, but the way the daylight falls was very, very well considered. So that issue of thinking about the history of museum design, often people think it's a post-war phenomenon. But actually, if you look back pre-war, I think, of course, they were classical architects, but they were still paying very close attention right back to Soane in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, to the way daylight comes through the roof and falls on the pictures. And you're quite correct that Louis Kahn was obsessed by light, but also David Chipperfield. I mean, the first time I ever met David Chipperfield in the 90s, I remember him talking at incredible length and with deep knowledge and great expertise about the way daylight plays on pictures. And certainly one of the tensions we had with the design of Burlington Gardens was, I think architects often want to retain existing natural daylight, and then the engineers want to control the light and they want to control the environment. And daylight is complicated because it changes during the course of the day. And that was also true of the North Galleries in the Sainsbury wing, where very controlled daylight, I think, sort of standardizes it, whereas actually natural daylight, I was always very aware of it in the very beautiful 19th century galleries at the Royal Academy, that in the summer exhibition, you could take the tarpaulins off the ceiling and you got really good quality daylight, and all the pictures look much better as a result. So we don't probably pay, although some architects do, real attention to the quality and character of daylight.
Can I just add something?
I'm going to. Well, I just want to add one thing first about Louis Kahn, because I think there's something very interesting Charles said about the variety of light. Kahn said as well that there will never be a single day like the other when he was thinking about the Kimbell, and that's sort of quite an interesting entrance of chance into these buildings, which also I suppose is something that is part of the idea of allowing people to move in whichever direction they choose. We're now in a museological context in which we have little arrows on the floor telling us which way we have to move. But it's almost as though there's an opportunity for multiple choices and for the happenstance of the natural world around the museum buildings.
Yeah, I mean, what I didn't say, which I had been going to say, actually, one of the great things about Penelope's exhibition was that it made you look and pay attention to the Gulbenkian and the displays upstairs. And as she has implied, they're so low key that actually, unless you're compelled to think about them, you move through them naturally. There's a lot of daylight. You look out into the garden. There's an internal courtyard. And there's not too much, so that actually it makes for a very carefully considered but deliberately low-key experience. Whereas often in the recent past, displays expected to be much more kind of obvious. And in the 60s, people were willing to be, I think, more low-key about it.
It's interesting to me because it's not a spectacular museum, but it's a very successful one in terms of the visitor response. But what I was going to say about the light is that one thing that came through clearly from the exhibition was that, of course, in the 50s and 60s, the architects were much, much freer in terms of what they could do because conservation was less developed and the rules were much less strict. So the Gulbenkian used a lot of daylight. You can see some of that on the screen. And the Smithsons, for example, in the show they staged in the Tate, they had tremendously powerful theatre lighting on the paintings, which simply isn't allowed now. It was about 10 times brighter than we would now allow on our abstract paintings from the 60s. So the flexibility of the period 50 years ago was quite extreme compared to now.
And Tom, if I can just jump in, I'm sorry, the etiquette of these virtual panels, I unmute when I can.
Good job.
Not to bring this back to the Frick Breuer thing, but when Frick built the historic house at 1 East 70th Street, it was completed in 1914. It was already part of his plan that eventually it would become a museum for the public after his death and that of his wife. And so the picture gallery that was built there already had this sort of state-of-the-art enormous skylight that would pour natural light onto all of the larger format paintings in there. And it's been, and also in the additions in the 1930s and so forth, natural light has been a very large component of the Frick. which is the complete you can see the Breuer building on the right. There are just a smattering of windows. And so we are now having to rely on a very different, literally when we say that these things will be seen under a new light, it's because the role of natural light is so distinctly different. I guess Breuer to some degree wanted to really control and harness the light that could come in. I mean, light does stream in through that great big window on Madison Avenue, the one you can see on the right there. But you know, like as Penelope was saying, this actually is a big problem for us. It has to be filmed. We have to cover it with enough to protect the objects inside from any too much, let's say, UV exposure, whatever we put there. And so the considerations that Breuer had, and of course he was planning for a museum of 20th century art versus something, you know.
Have I tried to create a false lineage here? Because in a sense, we've talked about gentle monumentality and buildings that are very open. But of course, the thing about the Breuer building is that its monumentality there on Madison Avenue, we can see the exterior on our screen, is anything but gentle. It might be handsome, it might be austere, but it's a big block. And I wonder whether you feel like it's a kind of case unto itself, this particular building, compared to some of the other examples. Materiality maybe is.
Yeah, in the discussions of this building, it's funny the way it's described as sort of, you know, domestic in scale. It's actually shorter than most of it's shorter than the building across the street on 75th and across the street on Madison Avenue, both of which were already pre-existing when the Breuer building was designed. So it is maybe intentionally, you know, smaller in a sense, but it also, in terms of monumentality and in terms of an architect creating an art object, let's say, plopped into the Upper East Side, you see those two concrete walls on either side of this monolith. Those are merely these two slices that are blocking out the view, almost framing the view from right here, so that the granite will not be interrupted by the commercial and the residential things further down the street. And so in a sense, there is a sort of a sense of singularity, let's say. It stands on its own. It is its own kind of sculptural form plopped in the middle of Madison Avenue.
Since you raised sculptural form, and I'm just looking at the building now and thinking, I always thought it has more windows, because I love that painting by Rebecca Cateman. It's in the Whitney Museum collection, where the window of the Breuer building becomes so central to this idea of things moving inside and outside. But actually, from the outside, staring at this image on my screen, it's like it's a cyclops there on Madison Avenue with this one big eye looking out. But since you talk about its sculptural form, I just want to go back to this idea of display, not in the Frick Madison project, and think about whether, Penelope, in the work that you did for the exhibition and your work at the Gulbenkian, and as a sculpture expert, whether you feel that a lot of these architects made a lot of flat art forms become something that was more sculptural, or whether sculpture was somehow became dominant as a form in the 50s and 60s because of how people were taking paintings away from the wall and thinking about new ways of displaying objects.
It's complicated. I think that they gave, well, if we talk about Scarpa and Albini, they gave a few paintings a sculptural quality. And again, that's partly to do with them choosing the right objects and then really focusing on them to make them a kind of eye catcher and literally an iconic work that would represent the museum for a long time to come. I think that they also managed to give paintings a three-dimensional quality by selecting them and standing them on easels and allowing people to walk around them. So in a way that they gave paintings a sculptural quality. I think that sculpture was not so very important to Scarpa and Albini. I think that they chose just a very few pieces, really not so very many. It was more that they transformed painting into sculpture. Whereas if we look at someone like Van Eyck, I think Aldo Van Eyck, was much more at home with sculpture and able to think about it in a more playful way, so that for him things could change heights, they could move around, children could play around them. I think that kind of ludic quality that you talked about earlier was crucial there. But I actually think that what was happening in sculpture probably is something quite different. It's too long. We haven't got time to talk about this now, but I think that in a way, what the architects were doing with the painting was you might say, a sculptural treatment, but also I would say a commercial treatment, that they were used to thinking about objects in shops and how to foreground objects for sale. And that could be a glass, a watch, or it could be a glass jar. I think it maybe was more to do with commercial vitrines and shop fronts, and less about actually what was happening in sculpture at the time. That's my first thoughts on that question.
So I just want to remind our audience that there are 2 chat boxes open, but I really, if anyone has questions, if they can put them in the Q&A box, and perhaps we can just have 5 or 10 minutes with any questions that have come in for our panel. Amy, this is probably quite a quick one, but it's kind of interesting in thinking about how exhibition design has developed since the 60s and 70s, whether you've simulated the presentation with digital means in terms of how you're going to work in the Breuer.
Yes, so because the curators are working with our longtime exhibition designer, Steve Encitas, he actually took it upon himself, because doing mock-ups at the Breuer, well, it was the Met Breuer was dismantling and we were moving in, being on site was not really going to be feasible. He took upon himself to sort of develop these virtual walkthroughs so that we could make many more, let's say, spatially informed decisions about the installation. But just having taken a stroll around the galleries last week, nothing is like being there, right? I think doing the virtual 3D walkthrough can get you as close as you can, but we know we've already warned our preparators. I'm sorry, things are going. We're going to make last minute changes when we have the objects there in the flesh and we see the way they're going to speak to each other in the room at human scale. So yes, good limit.
If there are any more questions coming through, I'm watching on the Q&A box. But in the meantime, let me ask Charles. I'll ask you a more personal question. You've traveled around a lot of these museums. I mean, do you feel that in general we see and interpret art different? It's a big question, but how do you feel you've seen and interpreted art differently in modern buildings?
It's not quite answering the question, but the experience I had also just before lockdown was that somebody said to me that my book would be incomplete if I didn't go and see Mona in Hobart. And so I did a day trip to Mona, which is not the most convenient place to go for the day. But actually I found it very interesting, because if you've been, it's designed in a way to be absolutely the opposite to a conventional museum, because it's underground. It's got it's a sort of deliberate theme park, and as you go down in the lift, you're confronted by a bar and somewhere to sit, so that it transgresses all the orthodoxies of museum design and display very deliberately. It's kind of 2 fingers to a traditional museum. But actually, I'm afraid I thought it was very, very successful. Partly because it uses this idea of being very exploratory, that you wander around. I mean, I wasn't there for nearly enough time because there's a huge amount to see and explore. It's not laid out in a tautological way. And the other thing is, it does what in a way is a very traditional thing, that there's no labeling whatsoever on the walls. The only way you can find out about the objects is through technology, that they have a thing called the O, which is how you find out about it. So that to me was actually really interesting, where somebody, basically the owner of the museum, decided to do something which was highly unconventional but I found it very adventurous, very exciting. And I think most people, I mean, 750,000 people go there a year, even in spite of the fact that it's in Tasmania. And they spend a really long time because there's a huge amount to explore. And I think that certainly made me think that there are new ways of doing things, that you shouldn't necessarily just fall back on the standard ways of displaying.
I think, if I could just add, one of the problems is to use the word modern. In fact, there are so many kinds of modern. So if we look at the Clark Museum, for example, the Clark Museum was a new museum, but it was a very old-fashioned style. So there's many kinds of modern, and there's good modern and bad modern. I think we should maybe think more about the difference between buildings that have a noble aspiration to last for a long time, and others which deliberately intend to find a way of being that can be continuously reinvented. And I think that's partly to do with people who are looking at exhibitions and people who are looking at permanent collections. But not only that, I think there's also a kind of inbuilt life cycle. And some museums think of themselves as having a life cycle of 25 or 50 years, and others think of themselves as changing every year. And so that makes a big difference to the way that the interior design will be made. And we too often talk about Albini and Scarpa as the architects of the museums, but they're not. They didn't design the buildings mostly. They designed the interior design. So we should talk more about, I think, the interior display and less about the architect. Whereas in the Breuer's case, in fact, you have the architect, and the architecture is a shell. It's not heavily designed inside, as you said. It's an empty building. Whereas Albini is exactly the opposite, that he filled what was the empty building with his interior design.
So is the Breuer building in some sense a precursor of what would come, the white cubes and glass boxes and so on, whereas actually these other buildings are very careful about the relationship of detail to artwork, and we've talked quite a lot about the curatorial impetus of some of these architects, but with Breuer that seems rather different.
I'll just interject to say you never forget that Breuer is there in the Breuer building. None of the walls that you build internally, even if this is sort of the curators can decide where they go, they'll never fully reach the ceiling, and the ceiling is a full concrete grid. You will never forget who has shaped this space, and so unless you create a white box within the Breuer building, it will never feel like a white box. Thankfully, maybe.
There's a question here, Penelope, I'll ask you about. The Gulbenkian is so attractive. I wonder if the building overpowers the collection. I mean, I think you would disagree with that, but I suppose let me rephrase that question and think, I suppose many of these buildings, they are part of a collection in their own right now, and they're sites of pilgrimage, and we're lucky that we have a few of them that still have their original displays. I think the building doesn't overpower the collection. I guess that's what I was saying earlier, and that's in many ways they hardly notice the building, but what they notice is that they've had a wonderful experience. And I think what the show wanted to do was to slightly pull apart the building and the interior, because they're by different people. And there's been a lot of attention paid to the architecture of the building, but not very much attention paid to the interior design of the museum. But no, people are looking at the objects, and because there aren't too many objects on show, they really have a chance to focus on that and not be overwhelmed. And when you ask them at the end, what is it they've enjoyed, they say they've enjoyed walking around the museum. And I think you might say that neither one overpowers the other. It's a very good balance between building, interior design, if I call it that, and the collection. Well, I'm under instructions and to end within an hour, so I'm going to draw this discussion to a close. I'm going to apologize again for my disembodied voice, and I hope that the sound hasn't been too intermittent for too many of you, but apologies for those of you who have had trouble with connecting. I found it a fascinating discussion, and I'm hugely looking forward to seeing what the Frick curators and team have done for Frick Madison. I hope we'll be able to come and see it next year, Amy. I want to thank Amy, Penelope, and Charles for their time this afternoon or evening. And thank you to TAFAF Online for hosting this talk. There is one more TAFAF talk, which is taking place at the same time tomorrow. Another topical discussion. It will be moderated by Apollo's deputy editor, Fatima Ahmed, and it's a discussion on the idea of the city as collector and the extent to which historical city collections might have a new relevance or meaning, or be reframed in the current situation that we all find ourselves in, with speakers from the New York Historical Society, the Kunstmuseum Den Haag, and the Petit Palais in Paris. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoy TAFAF Online. Good night.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you so much.